Welcome to the Wildland Fire Science series, where we explore different aspects of fire science, one person at a time. I had the delightful experience of learning from Lita Kobazar about hazardous wildland fuels and fuel treatments. After watching this video, you should be able to discuss fuel models, fire behavior, behave, the fire behavior model, fuel treatments, and the results of fuel treatments. Lita, one of the things I'm really interested in, and it's critical for fire, is about fuels and fuel models and fuel treatments. So that's really what I want to kind of hone in on today in our conversation.
Okay.
So could you, I know there's been a workshop going on about fuel treatments down in the southeast coastal plain.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain the fuels that you have down there and what the issues are? And
Sure. So most of my work has been done in the southern coastal plain, and the specific area where we've been conducting research is the Osceola National Forest. And that area is characterized as either mesic or hydric flatwoods. So sometimes they're pretty soggy if it's not a drought year. If it's a drought year, we don't have any standing water in them whatsoever, which means that all of the different strata of fuels are available to burn. So those strata include things like duff. If we're starting from the top of the soil, duff, which is partially decomposed litter or organic matter, litter, which is usually leaf litter, and then we have surface fuels that include the shrub strata, and then aerial fuels that include anything that's above the shrub strata. On the surface of the litter, and sometimes embedded within the litter, we also have what are called coarse woody debris fuels. And those are categorized into different categories based on their size, because as you know, the surface area to volume ratio makes a big difference in terms of how easily something burns and how long it burns. It also makes a big difference in terms of how quickly it responds to atmospheric moisture content. So for example, a very small fuel, like what we call a 1-hour fuel, would respond to an increase in relative humidity much more quickly than a very large fuel, like what we call a 1,000-hour fuel, would, meaning that if there's a change in temperature, a change in any other aspects of the environment, those small fuels will probably change more quickly in relation to those changes in environment.
so the fuel moisture will get equalized with the relative humidity.
Right. So
the small stuff can absorb it faster, is what you're telling me.
Exactly, because it has a much higher surface area to volume ratio. So our basic categorization of fuels is divided into 4 major classes, and those are the 1-hour, 10-hour, 100-hour, and 1,000-hour fuel categories. And those, again, are based on their sizes. So our 1-hour fuels are up to 1/4 inch in diameter. Our 10-hour fuels are from 1/4 inch in diameter to 1 inch in diameter. 100-hour fuels are 1 to 3 inches, and anything above 3 inches is considered a 1,000-hour fuel.
So what are the importance of these sizes, though, as far as the ignition and the spread of a fire?
So like I said, one of the reasons that they're called 1-hour to 1,000-hour represents the amount of time that it takes for them to equilibrate with the atmosphere. And that 1 hour doesn't actually mean that the fuel will equilibrate with the environmental relative humidity in 1 hour. It means that it will equilibrate to a certain percentage, which happens to be 63% of the difference between its initial moisture content and the moisture content of the atmosphere around it. So a 1-hour fuel is potentially going to be very moist in the morning. Around 10 o'clock, by that time, it will have dried significantly as relative humidity goes down as the day warms up. The 100-hour fuels and the 1,000-hour fuels probably won't have changed that much in that same amount of time, meaning that if you have a lightning ignition in these very small fuels, you'll probably have a better chance of getting a fire, getting a wildfire to occur, than if you have a lightning ignition in some of the larger fuels. So it also affects things like rate of spread as well, for the same reasons, that energy can be more quickly transferred through the smaller fuels, and flaming fronts can move more quickly through the smaller or finer fuels than they would through the larger fuels.
So I was just talking with Alan Long, and he was talking about fuels and the wildland-urban interface. And he was talking about treatments. And he didn't say anything else, he just said treatments.
Oh, okay.
So could you go into some of an explanation of how you treat, what the treatments are for these fuels?
Sure. So, I mean, ultimately, in the southern region, we have such a fantastic history of prescribed fire use and such, you know, even legislative support for prescribed fire use, that the major fuel treatment that we use is prescribed fire. So we use fire to fight fire, essentially. So if an area that has fire-adapted species to a fire regime that historically occurred, say, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, which would characterize pine flatwood systems, then applying fire every 1 to 5 years is a way to keep those fuel loads low so that when lightning does ignite or a wildfire does start, it doesn't grow into a catastrophic wildfire.
I just want to interrupt you for a second. You use the term pine flatwood system, and I've heard that many times, and I always have a question about what you are talking about, because I'm sure it's not the same across the Southeast, or is it? A pine flatwood system? Well,
it isn't, and it's not a perfect term. It's relative, and oftentimes to help distinguish differences between different types of pine flatwoods, we talk about how wet they are, or how much of the year their soils are either partially or in some cases fully inundated. So hydric pine flatwoods would occur at lower elevations, usually in the southern coastal plain, and like I said, it would have some standing water for at least the rainy season of the year. And then we go all the way to the dry pine flatwood sites that have more of a mixture of understory fuels that are adapted to live in those wetter environments versus those that are more competitive in drier environments. So you would have more of a mixture of something like saw palmetto in the understory with grasses and herbaceous species in a drier site versus probably ubiquitous saw palmetto in the wetter sites.
Okay, well that makes sense. Getting back to fuel treatments. So, you know, what are the fuel treatments that we can use other than prescribed fire?
Other than prescribed fire.
You can't put prescribed fire in places where the fuel load is too high.
Exactly. And that's really, you know, that's one of the things that makes it such a challenge to manage all of these systems that we have adapted to very frequent fire return intervals because of our lightning ignitions, because of the history of Native American fire use. Fire has played a role in these ecosystems frequently for many thousands of years. So to sort of maintain the ecosystem integrity, we need something to happen to allow for fires to burn, or we need to burn them in that certain amount of time. So they exceed that natural fire return interval quite quickly in pine flatwoods. So once you get beyond, you know, 5 years or so that fire has not been burned in a site, then the effects that fire has when it does burn in that site are very different than what would happen if fire had burned every 3 years. So, so oftentimes before prescribed fire can be reinstated in these fire-adapted systems, other kinds of fuel treatments will be necessary. And there are a variety of different ways that fuel treatments can be conducted. Other than prescribed burning, most of them involve mechanical manipulations. So that could either be mowing the fuels, chopping the fuels. You can use a variety of different types of equipment to do that. Sometimes the chopping of the fuels turns the soil a little bit. Sometimes it's only on the surface level. But ideally, the goal is to reduce the surface fuels, so to reduce the shrub cover, because that's usually what carries fire through these systems, and to ensure that the overstory trees are not harmed in these different fuel treatment types. But, like I said, the challenge is getting fire back into these systems that are fire adapted. Sometimes that requires a fuel treatment, a mechanical treatment, prior to the reinstatement of a fire regime.
Okay, so you have mowing, which was like with the bush hog or something like that, and that'll chop up things or cut things probably 2 inches in diameter or less?
It varies. It depends on how low the mower head is. If it is really getting into, like in the pine flatwood system, if it's affecting the rhizomes of the saw palmetto, then you're going to have bigger chunks. Otherwise, what you're getting is mostly foliage. So those are relatively thin pieces, but they could be as long as, you know, a foot or 2 feet in length. So one of the things that we're really interested in doing is characterizing how different types of fuel treatments create a new fuel profile. So they create a new layer of available fuel to burn, and we don't know all that much about exactly how that burns. So that's one of the things that we're focusing on the work that I referred to in the Osceola National Forest. Is figuring out how many small branches are there, how many bigger fuels, how these things compact over time, how they affect decomposition rates, and how they burn, of course, is the main question.
Okay, so when you do a chopping treatment, a chopping treatment was, what kind of machine do you use for that? Is that like a big drum chopper, or?
It could be a big drum chopper. There's so much variation that it would be hard for me to characterize exactly what's used for what. And some people use the term mowing synonymously with chopping, and out west we use the term mastication for anything that basically takes standing fuels and reduces their size, compacts them, and reduces their, essentially reduces the amount of oxygen that flows from one fuel particle to the next.
Well, I think of mastication as something where it's almost made into a mulch, whereas mowing is like you're cutting it like a mower, more or less, with a bush hog. And then chopping, I'm trying to get my handle on chopping other than a drum chopper, because that's the only thing I really know.
Yeah.
So you have 3 different types. Well, there's another one also, and I don't really recommend it because I don't think it's appropriate for fire, but for restoring fire, that's herbicides.
Right.
Do you ever consider those as a treatment, or is that
Well,
that's just a non-treatment?
Unfortunately, usually herbicides increases fire danger. So what you're left with often is standing dead material that is therefore quite flammable. It doesn't have its moisture content anymore, but structurally it may or may not have changed much at all. So in a lot of cases where herbicides have been used in plantations extensively, especially young plantations, we often see wildfires exceeding their boundaries on public lands perhaps, and moving on to those private lands that have young plantations where herbicide treatments were recently enacted. And that herbicided vegetation acts as a conduit for the spread of fire into those private lands. So sometimes that can be a real issue.
So that's not really a treatment for fuels. That's other than creating more hazardous fuel. Is that what you're telling me?
You know, it all depends on how long after the treatment we're asking the question. And with the amount of lightning that we have, I think it's important to consider the effectiveness of the treatment immediately after the treatment, as well as a certain, you know, iterations of time periods following the treatment. So right after the fuel treatment, it could be an increase in fire hazard. Then farther down the line, once those fuels start to decay and decompose and are no longer standing fuels, then potentially that fire hazard has been reduced. But the longevity of the effectiveness is also a question. How long will that herbicide be effective? How soon will vegetation start to recover and reoccupy that newly opened growing space? And does herbicide have to be reapplied, et cetera? It's also very expensive in comparison to using fuel reduction treatments like prescribed burning, which is, of course, the least expensive option that we have.
But, and correct me if I'm wrong, but prescribed burning can only be applied once the fuel load is at a manageable height, or can you apply it safely, you know, with any type of fuel load? Is there a limit?
Of course, I think there's a limit. What that limit is depends on a number of things. It depends on the ultimate objective, and it depends on the species in question. For example, we conducted prescribed burns in sites where the understory had not been burned, the site had not been burned for 11 years or more. And most people would consider that for pine flatwoods far outside of the historical range of variability, far outside that sort of target fire return interval that is appropriate for maintaining that ecosystem integrity. And we didn't see as terrible effects as we might have predicted, but we certainly saw more tree mortality, more crown volume scorch than we did in a location that was first mowed and then burned afterwards. And they were burned at the same time. So it's hard to tell exactly what that threshold is. It also depends on what kind of fire behavior characteristics you get in relation to what kind of weather parameters you have for the burn during that day. So another example is burning in a mowed site. In the summertime, we saw actually in the beginning of the summer, after a drought period, we saw some very high mortality. And that's because the trees were a little bit younger and smaller than in the sites where we didn't see much mortality. So I think it's really important to look at what you have and what you want to make sure you're not going to be deleteriously affecting by the application of fire, and take those things into consideration when prescribing the environmental weather parameters for conducting that prescribed burn.
Has any work been done on flame height on the same types of sites using the different treatments?
Yeah, actually, so I have a little bit of data here that I can share with you about that. So like I said, this is in the Osceola Forest, and we looked at a number of different factors in relation to different fuel treatments. And we did some modeling using Behave to do some assessments of predicted rate of spread and predicted flame length. And immediately...
So you might want to explain quickly what Behave is, because you said using Behave.
Sure, sorry. So, so Behave is a very user-friendly computer model. It's actually a modeling system, a combination of a number of different models or algorithms that's used to predict fire spread and fire effects. So fire behavior characteristics like flame length, like rate of spread, even fire line intensity, and then fire effects like percent of fuels consumed, the percent of crown scorch, the percent of trees that could potentially be killed following a fire.
Okay.
So it allows the user to input weather parameters and as outputs get information about what fire would look like if it were applied to a given site based on the quantification of those fuel characteristics that we talked about at the beginning of the interview.
And that's a pretty good predictor.
That's a
Question?
something
That's a question?
that we still have questions about. It was developed for fuels in the western U.S., and there have been great improvements in the last 7 to 10 years. There have been improvements in fuel models, so how we represent as a group different types of fuels across the southern systems, and there have been improvements just in terms of fire behavior predictions. So it's improving all the time, and I think probably the most important thing is for us to make sure that those of us who experiment with it and use it, especially fire managers, get feedback to the scientists who are creating the algorithms to make these predictions.
Okay, you can go on. I just wanted that explained a little bit.
Sure. So we looked at a couple of different effects, and we addressed potential fire behavior looking at immediate post-treatment conditions. So this is immediately following mowing is shown in the yellow, and burning plus mowing is shown in the red. And the control or untreated sites are shown in the green. And what we saw immediately following the treatments is that there was a pretty big difference in the burn and mow plus burn. I'm sorry, the burn and mow plus burn were similar. The mow and the control sites both had higher predicted rates of spread, as well as having higher predicted flame lengths. So that's what we expected to see. What we actually saw was even, you might say, worse than what we expected to see based on the model. Our observed predicted rate of spread in the control was even higher than what was predicted, and much higher than what we saw in the mowed site in reality.
Wow.
And our observed control, once we burned it, was much higher flame lengths than what we expected to see based on the predictions in the model. So we have these 11-year sites that had no treatment and were burned. We got pretty high flame lengths, a lot of crown scorch, and pretty high rates of spread in comparison to the areas that had been first burned and mowed and then burned.
And that's interesting.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, that made sense. So the predictions aren't very good. Is that what you're saying, or are those within the
these predictions?
Cone of error?
We would suggest that these predictions probably were not very accurate. But just like anything else, it depends what you put into the model, what you get out of the model. So there's some discussion about whether, you know, some of the parameters, we could shift some of the parameters to get better predictions that match our observations better, and then look back at the particular fuel models and how they were characterized and see if we can make improvements. So that's something that we're contributing to and that we're really interested in doing. But the next thing that I just wanted to point out is also very interesting. I mentioned that you know, when evaluating the effectiveness of fuel treatments, it all depends on how long after the fuel treatment you are asking the questions about its effectiveness. And so this is showing 6 months following the burn and 12 months following mowing. And if you look at predicted rates of spread, they're almost exactly the same. And predicted flame lengths, almost exactly the same amongst the different treatments, the comparative treatments. The control just being a little bit longer, and that's really only a difference of about ½ a meter, so not a very big difference there. So even only within 6 months of burning these sites, the predicted fire behavior in comparison to the control suggests that burning has not had a significant impact on potential rate of spread.
No. Or mowing or
mowing plus burning.
Right.
Yeah. So we were a little surprised to see that.
Is that discouraging to you about treatments, or?
No, I think what it really does is emphasize that well, first, that we need to do treatments often, and one treatment isn't enough. But then after that, you know, these systems are adapted to fire, and that doesn't mean that they're adapted to withstand fire. In these cases, especially with incredibly flammable fuels like gallberry and saw palmetto, they are adapted to burn. They're incredibly flammable. So it's not inappropriate for fires to burn in these systems. It's exactly the right thing. And I think all too often we separate wildfires from prescribed fires, saying that one type of fire is good and one type is bad. In many cases, you know, the best type of fire is one that we plan for and control as much as we can. But certainly this suggests that fuel treatments are necessary and need to be an iterative process and repeated.
So what, just to go with that, what would be the natural or the desired fire frequency?
So the desired fire frequency in this area is between 3 and 5 years. So the Osceola forest, they are successful in burning about 30,000 acres each year, which is really impressive.
That's a lot. So how big is that forest?
It's about 300,000 acres.
So 1/10 of the forest every year.
Mm-hmm. And they have a lot of embedded swamps as well. So those have higher historical fire return intervals.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's change the subject a little bit. So I was wondering what, you know, some of the imperatives are for prescribed fire if you wanted to maintain a certain ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about the coastal plain also. So,
okay. Yeah,
so
specifically in the coastal plain.
Right.
Well, like I mentioned, you know, this area has been influenced by fire for thousands of years, first by lightning and then also by Native American fire use. So even when the early explorers came to the southern coastal plain, they made observations of wide expanses of burned forested areas. Navigable space was plentiful. It was easy for DeSoto to move 600 men from Tampa Bay all the way up to Tallahassee. They could just walk right through the forest with no problem seeing enemies from a great distance. So we have the combination of lightning, and we have the combination of lightning with Native American fire use. And both of those things together have resulted in numerous fire-adapted ecosystems. So I think that's really the first imperative, is that ecologically speaking, we have numerous species and assemblages of communities that are adapted to a very frequent fire return interval and will change significantly if any aspect of what we term the fire regime is changed. So I think that's probably the most important imperative, ecologically speaking. But also, you know, we have human populations, and we have human dwellings that are located within the context of these large expanses of wildlands. And if we don't control fuels, if we don't use prescribed fire especially, then the fires that we have that occur are likely to be much harder to control, much larger in size, have much more of a deleterious impact on the surrounding population, and be really costly in terms of suppression. And you compare something like the southern region's suppression budget to the suppression budget of California. We never want to go there. We don't want to have to invest billions of dollars. And the reason that we don't have to do that in the southern region is largely associated with our ability to control fuels through prescribed fire use.
So prescribed fire use is fairly ubiquitous across the southeastern coastal plain, or the southeast in general? Or is it?
It depends on the ecosystem, absolutely. In Florida in particular, there are about 25 different 25 different communities, vegetative communities, and 16 of those are considered fire dependent. And the fire dependence doesn't mean that that fire occurs frequently necessarily. So some of those fire-dependent ecosystems are like the sandpine scrub system or even cypress swamps. And those systems also evolved in the context of fire and have some fire-adapted species, but traditionally burned only during drought periods or under very, very severe fire weather conditions. So if you put those together, drought and severe fire weather conditions, those areas will still burn. So all of them have been characterized by fire. Whether or not prescribed fire is employed in all of these systems largely depends on the ease of prescribed fire application and the safety concerns. So, for example, we have a crown fire system, the sandpine scrub system in the central ridge of Florida, and if the only type of fire that passes through that system passes across the crowns of fires, and as everybody has seen, you know, those types of fires are very high intensity, create a lot of smoke, and move very quickly, so they're very hard to control. But they have developed a prescribed fire use system that allows them to actually burn crown fires. And that's unparalleled in the world, honestly. It's very impressive, the skill that managers have with using prescribed fire, even in these places that have fire regimes that are considered quite dangerous and hard to control.
So how close can they do something like that to a human dwelling?
Well, in the sandpine scrub system, as long as you have defensible space around the unit that's being burned, it can be done within, I don't know, maybe a quarter mile, somewhere along those lines, all depending on which way the wind's blowing.
Yeah, and the weather, of
and
course.
the weather,
yeah.
And smoke is a major concern too. You know, it's very important to consider what kind of effects any of these prescribed burns are having on people's ability to breathe fresh air. So that's, you know, a #1 priority in deciding how and when and where prescribed fire is employed across the whole southeastern region.
Okay, and just, you know, kind of a final thing is, you mentioned the difference between the southeastern fire budget and the western fire budget. Is that because there's a difference in fuel types, or what's causing that major difference in cost? Obviously it's more expensive out west, other than we do prescribe fire, but we don't do it everywhere.
That's true.
I know that, at least.
Well, there are some important statistics to keep in mind. We do more prescribed burning, so we have our systems that are fire adapted and will have wildfires occur in them are more likely to have small, easily suppressed wildfires than their systems. So in much of the western U.S., fires have been suppressed for nearly 100 years. And so they have 100 years of fuel load buildup, whereas fire suppression here, it's more on the range of 30 to 40 years at worst. And we're still able to burn 1.2 million acres on average every year in the southern region. So we do more fuels control than anywhere else in the world in the southern region. And because of that, or related to that, our wildfires tend to be very small, which means they're inexpensive to suppress, and they don't cause the kind of subsequent costs that are associated with large wildfires that can't be controlled.
Wow, that's a great story.
Yeah,
I don't
a lot
think very
to be
many
proud
people.
of.
I don't think very many people know about it. Anyway, thanks. You did a great job.
Thank you.